Story number 1. The Red-Eyed Santa. Minnesota winters have a way of making everything feel quieter, lonelier. The snow blankets the world, muffling sound and casting everything in an eerie stillness. Christmas in 1995 was no different. Our small town of Clearbrook was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless fields of white and dense woods that seemed to stretch forever. That Christmas Eve started like any other. My parents, my younger sister Sarah, and I spent the evening decorating cookies, sipping hot cocoa, and watching A Charlie Brown Christmas in our cozy living room. The fireplace crackled warmly, and the trees sparkled with twinkling lights. Outside, the snow fell steadily, piling up against the windowsills. But by midnight, that comforting stillness turned into something much darker. It began with a knock at the door. It wasn't the friendly kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor dropping off cookies or carolers spreading holiday cheer. It was slow, deliberate, 3 heavy thuds that seemed to reverberate through the house. "Who could that be at this hour?" my dad said, glancing at the clock. It was 11:58 p.m. He stood up, tightening the belt of his robe. "Probably someone stuck in the snow." My mom looked uneasy. "Be careful," she said. Her voice hushed. Sarah and I watched from the couch as my dad made his way to the door. He flicked on the porch light and peered through the peephole. For a moment, he froze. "Who is it?" my mom asked, her voice trembling. Dad didn't answer. Slowly, he unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man dressed as Santa Claus, or something resembling Santa Claus. His red suit was dirty and torn, the fur trim yellowed and matted. His hat was askew, and his beard, though thick, looked more like a tangled mess of cobwebs than anything jolly. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. They glowed a deep, unnatural red, like embers smoldering in a dying fire. His face was pale, almost corpse-like, and his grin stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were yellowed and jagged. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice low and raspy, like the creak of an old door. My dad took a step back. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice unsteady. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, his glowing eyes fixed on my dad, his grin never faltering. "Who is it?" my mom asked again, standing up from the couch. "Just someone dressed as Santa," my dad said, his voice trembling. "I don't know, maybe a prank. Should I call the police?" my mom asked. At that, the man's grin widened impossibly, his teeth glinting in the faint porch light. "No need for that," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "I was just passing through, spreading some holiday cheer." "Look," my dad said, trying to keep his composure. "It's late. You should go." The man tilted his head, his glowing eyes flicking toward the living room window where Sarah and I sat frozen in fear. "Lovely family," he said, so full of Christmas spirit. That was enough for my dad. He stepped back and slammed the door, locking it quickly. "Everyone stay away from the windows," he said, his voice urgent. "I'm calling the police." We huddled together in the living room as my dad grabbed the phone. But when he picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone, just static. "That's weird," he muttered, hanging up and trying again. Still static. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. Before my dad could answer, the knocking resumed, louder this time, more forceful. It wasn't just at the front door anymore. It was coming from the windows, the back door, even the walls. The sound seemed to surround us, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We sat there, holding our breath, straining to hear any sound. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. "I think he's gone," my dad said finally, though he didn't sound convinced. But then Sarah screamed. She was staring at the living room window, her face pale as a ghost. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. The man Santa was standing outside, his red eyes glowing brighter than ever. He raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a smudged, black mark that looked like soot. His grin never wavered. My dad grabbed the fireplace poker and rushed toward the window. But before he could get there, the man vanished, gone, as if he'd never been there. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and confusion. We double-checked every lock, boarded up the windows, and huddled together in the living room, waiting for dawn. The knocking didn't return, but the sense of being watched never left. When morning finally came, we found footprints in the snow leading from the woods to our porch. They were large and deep, like boots, but instead of leading back to the woods, they stopped abruptly in the middle of the yard. The black mark on the window was still there, despite our best efforts to scrub it away. Over the next few weeks, strange things continued to happen. We'd hear faint laughter at night, distant but unmistakable. Shadows moved in the corners of our vision, and Sarah swore she saw red eyes staring at her from the tree line one evening. We eventually moved out of that house, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The new owners never reported anything unusual, but every Christmas Eve, I still find myself holding my breath, waiting for the knock. And sometimes, when the snow falls just right and the night grows quiet, I swear I can see him, standing at the edge of the woods, his red eyes glowing in the darkness, his grin stretched wide, waiting. Story number 2. The Santa in the Shadows. California isn't where you'd expect to find a traditional Christmas, especially in a small, sun-drenched town near the coast. There's no snow, no roaring fireplaces, just chilly ocean breezes and streets lined with palm trees wrapped in holiday lights. In 2016, my friends and I were restless college kids, spending the holidays far from home. Christmas Eve found us bored and looking for something to do. And in our boredom, we made a decision I'd regret for the rest of my life. Let's check out the old Prescott house, Jamie suggested, her eyes gleaming with mischief. She was always the instigator, the one with the wild ideas. The Prescott house was a crumbling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. Abandoned for decades, rumors swirled around it, stories of hauntings, disappearances, and strange sightings. Most of the town avoided it, but we were young, reckless, and eager for a thrill. It's Christmas Eve, I said, trying to talk her out of it. Shouldn't we be doing something festive? This is festive, Jamie argued. It's like a Christmas ghost story. Come on, Caleb, don't be a killjoy. Against my better judgment, I agreed, along with 2 other friends, Mark and Lisa, armed with flashlights and too much confidence. We piled into Jamie's car and headed to the house. The Prescott house loomed in the darkness, its peeling paint and broken windows giving it a skeletal appearance. Overgrown weeds choked the yard, and the wind whistled through the cracks in its walls, carrying a faint, eerie groan. "This is such a bad idea," Lisa muttered as we approached the front door. She clutched her flashlight like a weapon, her knuckles white. "Relax," Jamie said, pushing the door open with a creak. "It's just an old house." The air inside was stale and cold, thick with the scent of mildew. Dust motes danced in the beams of our flashlights as we stepped cautiously into the foyer. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, making us jump. "This place is a death trap," Mark said, his voice low. "Let's make this quick." We wandered through the house, our laughter and nervous chatter echoing off the walls. Most of the rooms were empty, their furniture long gone. But in the living room, we found something strange. A massive Christmas tree, long dead, its dry needles littering the floor. And next to it, standing in the corner, was a statue of Santa Claus. It was an old, life-sized figure, his paint faded and chipped. The red suit was cracked and peeling, the beard yellowed with age. But what struck me most was its face, twisted into an unsettling grin that was both jolly and grotesque. Its eyes, glassy and black, seemed to follow us as we moved around the room. "Creepy," Lisa whispered, edging closer to me. Why would someone leave this here? Jamie, of course, wasn't fazed. It's just a statue, she said, moving toward it. Come on, it's kind of funny. Let's take a picture with it. Bad idea, I said. But Jamie was already posing next to the figure, her arms slung around its shoulders like they were old friends. Mark snapped the photo, and as the flash went off, the statue tipped forward. It hit the ground with a heavy thud, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. And then, to our horror, it made a noise, a low, guttural chuckle that sent chills racing down my spine. What the hell? Lisa screamed, backing away. It's probably one of those motion-activated things, Jamie said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. But I knew better. The sound hadn't come from the statue's chest or speakers. It had come from its mouth. I swore I saw its lips twitch, the corners of its grotesque grin curling upward. Let's get out of here, Mark said, his voice trembling. None of us argued. We ran from the house, stumbling over the uneven ground in our haste to escape. As we reached the car, I glanced back and froze. The Santa statue was standing in the front window, his black eyes fixed on us, his head tilted ever so slightly. Caleb, come on, Jamie shouted, yanking me into the car. I slammed the door, and we sped away, the house disappearing into the night. We tried to laugh it off on the drive home, blaming our fear on overactive imaginations and the creepy atmosphere. But something had changed. The air in the car felt heavy, oppressive, as though we'd brought something with us. I couldn't shake the image of that statue, the way its eyes seemed to bore into me. And I wasn't the only one. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the faint sound of laughter, low and hollow. It echoed in my ears, growing louder and more insistent. I turned on every light in the room, but there was nothing there. I didn't sleep. Over the next few weeks, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and I heard footsteps in the hall when no one else was home. Lisa called me one night, her voice frantic. I saw it, Caleb. She whispered. I saw it outside my window, the Santa. It was watching me. Mark reported similar experiences, strange noises, fleeting glimpses of something red in the darkness. Even Jamie, who had laughed off the whole thing, stopped returning our calls. By February, Lisa had moved to another state, and Mark refused to talk about what happened. Jamie disappeared entirely, her apartment abandoned, her phone disconnected. The police found no signs of foul play, but I knew the truth. The Santa had followed us, and it wasn't done. Even now, years later, I still feel its presence. Every Christmas, the laughter returns, echoing through the night like a cruel reminder. I see its shadow in the corner of my eye, his black eyes watching, waiting. I've tried to forget, to move on, but the memory of that night haunts me. The Santa in the Prescott house wasn't just a statue. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent, wearing a twisted mask of holiday cheer. And every year, it gets closer. Story number 3. The Midnight Visitor. Christmas in Ohio is always a quiet affair. The snow blankets the ground, muffling the sounds of the world, leaving everything feeling still and peaceful. In December 2007, my wife, Claire, and I were living in a small, cozy house on the outskirts of Dayton. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace, but it was home. That Christmas was supposed to be just the 2 of us. A simple holiday spent watching movies, drinking hot cocoa, and enjoying the calm of the season. But calm wasn't what we got. The night started innocently enough. We'd just finished dinner, a modest roast chicken with mashed potatoes, and were settling in on the couch to watch A Christmas Carol. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Outside, the snow was falling steadily, covering the yard in a pristine white blanket. It was the kind of night that felt timeless, like a postcard come to life. Around 11:30 p.m., Claire decided to head to bed, leaving me to finish the movie alone. I stayed up, the quiet of the house lulling me into a sense of contentment. But just as the credits began to roll, I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor or delivery person. It was slow, rhythmic, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the house. Then silence. I froze, the remote still in my hand, and glanced at the clock on the wall. Midnight. Who knocks on someone's door at midnight on Christmas Eve? For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But then the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I stood and made my way to the door. "Who is it?" I called, my voice steady despite the unease creeping into my chest. There was no response, just the faint sound of snow crunching outside. Slowly, I unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open. Standing on the porch was a man dressed as Santa Claus. At least, I think it was a man. His red suit was oversized, the fur trim yellowed and frayed. His hat was pulled low over his face, and his beard, clearly fake, hung awkwardly, obscuring most of his features. The only thing I could see were his eyes, dark and glittering beneath the shadow of the hat. They were fixed on me, unblinking. "Merry Christmas," I said hesitantly, my breath fogging in the cold air. "Can I help you?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, perfectly still, his gloved hands hanging at his sides. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice tinged with nervous laughter. "Need directions?" Still nothing. I was about to close the door when he moved. It wasn't much, just a slight tilt of his head, like he was studying me. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his boots crunching softly in the snow. I watched as he disappeared into the darkness, his red suit fading into the shadows beyond the porch light. Shaking off the unease, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. By the time I climbed into bed, Claire was already asleep, her breathing soft and steady. I didn't tell her about the visitor. I wasn't even sure what to make of it myself. The next morning, the snow had stopped, and the world outside was bright and serene. Claire and I exchanged gifts over coffee, and for a while, I managed to forget about the strange encounter. But when I stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the snow. They started at the street, led directly to our front porch, and then nothing. They didn't go back to the street. They didn't lead to another house. They just stopped, as though the man in the Santa suit had vanished into thin air. I showed Claire, and she tried to rationalize it. "Maybe the snow covered his tracks," she suggested, though her voice was uncertain. But the footprints were sharp, the edges crisp against the undisturbed snow around them. There was no wind, no sign of any disturbance. It didn't make sense. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At night, I swore I heard faint tapping on the windows, but whenever I checked, there was nothing there. Claire dismissed it as my imagination, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she jumped at small noises. She felt it too. The final straw came a week later. We just returned from visiting Claire's parents, our arms full of leftovers and gifts. As I unlocked the front door, I froze. Propped against the doorframe was a small package, wrapped in red paper with a white bow. There was no tag, no note, just the gift. "Did you order something?" Claire asked, her voice uneasy. "No," I said, picking up the package. It was light, almost weightless, and cold to the touch. We brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Open it," Claire finally said, with trembling hands. I tore the paper away, revealing a small, ornate snow globe. Inside was a tiny replica of our house, complete with the oak tree in the yard and the string of Christmas lights we'd hung on the porch. As I turned it over, snow swirled around the miniature scene, glittering in the soft light. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Inside the snow globe, standing on the porch of the tiny house, was a figure in a red suit. His hat was pulled low, his beard obscuring his face. And even though it was just a figurine, I could feel his eyes watching me. We didn't stay in the house much longer. By New Year's, we'd packed our things and moved to an apartment in the city. I never told the new owners about the midnight visitor, or the footprints, or the snow globe. Some things are better left unsaid. To this day, I can't look at a Santa costume without feeling a chill run down my spine. Every Christmas, I wonder if he's still out there, wandering the snowy streets, looking for the next door to knock on. And every Christmas Eve, when the clock strikes midnight, I hold my breath and wait, listening for the sound of 3 soft knocks. Story number 4. The Santa in the photo. Christmas in Texas has its own charm. Even without snow, the warm glow of lights and the festive spirit fill every home, creating a sense of magic in the air. In 2015, my family and I were determined to make it the best Christmas ever. Our new house in Austin was the perfect setting for a cozy holiday. A sprawling ranch-style home with a wide porch and a towering oak tree weed adorned with twinkling lights. It was our first Christmas in the house, and everything seemed perfect. My wife, Jenna, and I had spent weeks decorating. The tree in the living room was loaded with ornaments. Stockings were hung on the fireplace, and Christmas carols played softly in the background. Our kids, Ethan and Lily, were excited for Santa's arrival, and we planned to capture every moment. That Christmas Eve, we decided to take a family photo in front of the tree. Little did we know, the image we captured would haunt us for years to come. The night started off innocently enough. We just finished dinner and gathered in the living room for hot cocoa and cookies. Ethan, who was 9, was busy arranging presents under the tree, while Lily, only 6, twirled around in her sparkly red dress. Jenna grabbed the camera and set it up on the mantel, angling it perfectly to capture the tree, the fireplace, and all 4 of us. "Everyone gather around," Jenna called, setting the timer. I scooped Lily into my arms and stood beside Ethan, who grinned excitedly. Jenna joined us, and we all smiled as the camera's timer began its countdown. 3, 2, 1, click. The camera flashed, momentarily lighting up the room. We laughed and checked the preview screen, making sure no one had blinked. The photo looked perfect, a picture of holiday joy. Satisfied, we tucked the kids into bed, promising them Santa would arrive soon, and settled in for the rest of the evening. It wasn't until the next morning, as we reviewed the photos on Jenna's laptop, that we noticed it. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The tree sparkled in the background. The stockings hung neatly by the fireplace, and all of us wore big, genuine smiles. But then Jenna froze, her face draining of color. "Tom," she whispered, pointing at the screen. Who is that?" I leaned in, squinting at the photo. At first, I didn't understand what she meant. Then I saw it. Behind us, partially obscured by the tree, stood a figure dressed as Santa Claus. He wore the classic red suit and hat, but something about him was wrong. His face was pale, almost gray, and his features were distorted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. His eyes were dark, sunken pits, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that sent a chill down my spine. "Did you invite someone to play Santa?" I asked Jenna, my voice shaking. She shook her head. "No." "Did you?" "No." We stared at the screen in stunned silence. The figure hadn't been there when we took the photo. We'd been alone in the living room. There was no way someone could have slipped in unnoticed. Ethan and Lily came bounding into the room, eager to open presents. Jenna quickly closed the laptop, not wanting them to see the photo. I forced a smile and tried to focus on the kids, but the image of that distorted Santa lingered in my mind. That evening, after the kids were asleep, Jenna and I examined the photo again. We zoomed in on the figure, hoping to find some logical explanation, a trick of the light. a decoration we'd forgotten about. But the closer we looked, the more unsettling it became. The Santa wasn't just standing there. He was staring directly at the camera. His dark eyes seemed to bore into us, and his twisted grin looked almost alive, as if it were stretching wider the longer we stared. Maybe it's a prank, Jenna suggested weakly. Someone dressed up and snuck in while we weren't looking. But how? I asked. We were all standing right there, and why would they look like that? Neither of us had an answer. The days that followed were marked by strange occurrences. The kids' toys moved on their own. Ethan's toy train set, which hadn't worked in years, started running in the middle of the night. Lily's favorite doll, which always sat on her bed, would be found in different rooms. Lights flickered, even though we'd recently replaced the bulbs. And the house grew cold, no matter how high we set the thermostat. One night, as I was locking up, I heard faint jingling, like sleigh bells, coming from outside. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. But the yard was empty. The oak tree lights swayed gently in the breeze, casting eerie shadows across the snowless lawn. As I turned to go back inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the window, just at eye level, was a handprint. It was small and smeared, as though someone had pressed their palm against the glass and dragged it downward. But the kids were asleep, and Jenna hadn't left the house all day. Desperate for answers, I decided to do some research. I scoured local forums and archives, looking for any mention of strange events in our area. That's when I came across the story. Decades ago, a man named Victor Lang had lived in the house. He was known for dressing up as Santa Claus and delivering gifts to the neighborhood kids. But in 1972, on Christmas Eve, something happened. While visiting a family down the street, Victor suffered a massive heart attack and died. The children had been sitting on his lap when it happened, their laughter turning to screams as he collapsed. Since then, locals had whispered about Victor's ghost, claiming to see a figure in a Santa suit wandering the area on Christmas Eve. Some said he was harmless, a lonely spirit still trying to spread holiday cheer. But others believed he was something darker, his spirit twisted by the trauma of his death. That Christmas marked the end of our holiday traditions in that house. The following year, we moved, unable to shake the memories of that eerie photo and the strange events that followed. To this day, I can't look at a picture of Santa Claus without feeling a twinge of unease. And every Christmas, as the night grows quiet and the world settles into sleep, I think about Victor Lang. I wonder if he's still out there, wandering the streets in his red suit, searching for a family to visit. And I wonder who he's staring at now. Story number 5. The Silent Sleigh. Michigan winters are no joke. The snow falls thick, blanketing the world in an eerie quiet that feels both beautiful and suffocating. In December 2009, my family and I were living in a small town just outside Traverse City. Our house sat at the edge of a dense pine forest. Cozy, secluded place that was perfect for raising kids, or so I thought. That Christmas Eve, the air was heavy with the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. My wife, Emily, our 2 kids, Sophie and Max, and I had just finished watching It's a Wonderful Life and were preparing to tuck the kids into bed. The tree lights twinkled softly in the living room, and the smell of gingerbread cookies lingered in the air. It was the kind of night that felt timeless, like a memory in the making. And then, we heard the bells. At first, it was faint, a soft, rhythmic jingling that drifted through the cold night air. Emily paused, her hand hovering over the light switch. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I nodded, my heart skipping a beat. It was faint but distinct, like the sound of sleigh bells. Max, who was 7 at the time, grinned. "It's Santa," he exclaimed, his excitement lighting up the room. Sophie, 2 years older and skeptical of the whole Santa thing, rolled her eyes but still glanced toward the window, curiosity flickering in her eyes. I walked over to the front door, opening it just enough to peer outside. The snow-covered yard stretched out before me, untouched save for the faint shimmer of moonlight. The forest beyond was dark and still. Then I heard it again, louder this time. The jingling was accompanied by a soft thud, like footsteps crunching in the snow, except they weren't coming from the ground. They were coming from above. On the roof, Emily whispered, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" Max bolted toward the window, his little face pressed against the frosty glass. "I bet it's the reindeer," he said, practically vibrating with excitement. But Sophie stepped back, her expression uneasy. "Dad," she said quietly, "what if it's not?" I forced a laugh, trying to keep the mood light. "It's probably just snow sliding off the roof," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. Another thud echoed above us, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy shifting. The bells jingled again, louder and more insistent. "I'm going to check it out," I said, grabbing my coat and flashlight. Emily grabbed my arm. "Be careful," she said, her voice trembling. I stepped out into the freezing night, the snow crunching under my boots. The air was so cold it felt like needles against my skin, and my breath came out in thick, white clouds. I shone the flashlight upward, scanning the roof. At first, I saw nothing, just the blank expanse of snow glistening in the moonlight. But then, as the light swept across the far edge of the roof, I saw it. A figure stood silhouetted against the night sky, tall and motionless. It wore what appeared to be a Santa suit, the red fabric stark against the white snow. But something about it was off. The suit hung strangely, as though it didn't quite fit. The figure's head was tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "Who's up there?" The figure didn't move. The bells jingled again, startling me. The sound wasn't coming from the figure but from somewhere behind it. I shifted the flashlight beam, and that's when I saw it, a sleigh, a full-sized sleigh, perched precariously on the roof's edge. The wood was old and splintered, the red paint peeling away, and hitched to the sleigh were two reindeer, or at least, that's what they were supposed to be. Their bodies were gaunt, their fur patchy and matted, their antlers twisted unnaturally, almost like gnarled branches, and their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the flashlight beam like dull, red coals. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Hey!" I shouted again, my voice breaking. "What are you doing up there?" This time, the figure moved, slowly, turned its head toward me, the motion jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. It raised one gloved hand and pointed directly at me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted back into the house, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and my breath came in ragged gasps. "What did you see?" Emily asked, her face pale. "There's someone up there," I said, struggling to find the words. "And a sleigh." And I trailed off, not wanting to scare the kids. "It's not normal." Sophie clutched Max's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator answered, and I tried to explain what was happening without sounding insane. "There's someone on our roof," I said. "And I don't know. It's weird. Please, just send someone." The wait for the police felt like an eternity. The sounds on the roof continued, footsteps pacing back and forth, the jingling of bells, and occasionally, a soft scraping noise, like something being dragged. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was up there wasn't gone. It was waiting. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sleigh, no reindeer. The roof was undisturbed, as though no one had ever been there. They chalked it up to a prank or an overactive imagination. But I knew what I saw. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the image of the figure on the roof. The way it had pointed at me, the sound of those bells. It stayed with me, haunting my dreams. I started digging into the history of our property. Desperate for answers, what I found only deepened the mystery. Decades ago, a man named Charles Anders had lived in the area. He was known for dressing up as Santa Claus every Christmas, delivering gifts to the local children in a homemade sleigh. But one year, he vanished during a snowstorm, his sleigh and reindeer found abandoned in the woods. His body was never recovered. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. Was it the spirit of Charles Anders, doomed to wander in search of the Christmas he'd lost? Or was it something darker? Something wearing the guise of Santa to lure us outside? All I know is that every Christmas Eve, when the snow falls and the night grows quiet, I listen carefully, and sometimes, just on the edge of hearing, I think I can hear it again, the faint jingling of bells, and the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the roof. Story number 6. The Christmas Visitor. Pennsylvania winters have a way of making everything feel quieter. Like the snow muffles not just sound but time itself. The Christmas of 1998 was no different. I was 12 years old, and my family had just moved into a new house on the outskirts of Harrisburg. The house was an old colonial, built sometime in the early 1900s, with creaky wooden floors, a wraparound porch, and a fireplace that seemed tailor-made for Christmas stockings. It was our first holiday in the new house, and my parents were determined to make it special. My mom strung lights around the porch, and my dad chopped down a tree from the woods behind the house, a towering evergreen that brushed the ceiling of our living room. By Christmas Eve, the house looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. That night, the three of us, my parents and I, gathered around the fireplace after dinner. Snow was falling softly outside, blanketing the yard in white. We sipped hot cocoa and told stories, the warmth of the fire chasing away the chill. It was the kind of night that felt safe, cozy, like nothing bad could ever touch us. And then came the knock. It was soft at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. I thought I'd imagined it until it came again. Louder this time, 3 sharp knocks, like someone rapping their knuckles against the front door. My dad frowned and stood up. "Who would be out in this weather?" he muttered, glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight. He opened the door, and there he was. A man stood on our porch, dressed as Santa Claus. His red suit was trimmed with white fur, and his boots left deep prints in the snow. He carried a sack slung over one shoulder, and his face, mostly obscured by a thick white beard, wore a gentle smile. But what struck me most were his eyes, dark, glinting, and almost sad. "Ho, ho, ho," he said, his voice deep and warm. "Merry Christmas." My dad hesitated, glancing back at my mom. Merry Christmas to you, too. Can we help you?" "I'm just spreading a little holiday cheer," the man said, his smile widening. "May I come in?" Now, my dad wasn't the type to let strangers into the house, especially not in the middle of the night. But there was something disarming about the man, something that made it hard to say no. Maybe it was the suit, or the way he carried himself, like he belonged there, against his better judgment. My dad stepped aside and let him in. The man entered slowly, brushing snow from his boots. He looked around the living room, his gaze lingering on the tree and the stockings hung above the fireplace. "Beautiful decorations," he said. "You've really captured the spirit of Christmas." "Thank you," my mom said cautiously. "Are you a neighbor?" The man chuckled. "Something like that." He set his sack down by the tree and began pulling out small wrapped gifts, placing them carefully under the branches. "For the little one," he said, nodding toward me. I froze. The way he said it, it wasn't like he was guessing. It was like he knew exactly who I was. My dad cleared his throat. "This is very kind of you, but we weren't expecting anyone tonight. Are you sure you're at the right house?" The man smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." For the next hour, the man regaled us with Christmas stories, some funny, some wistful, all told with a strange familiarity that made it feel like he wasn't a stranger at all. He knew things about us, little details we hadn't shared. He mentioned the broken ornament my mom had fixed earlier that day, and the way my dad had struggled to light the tree without tripping the breakers. He even knew about the sweater I was wearing, a gift from my grandmother that I hadn't opened until that night. My parents exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them confronted him. It was like the man had cast a spell over the room, his presence both comforting and unsettling. At one point, my dad excused himself to check the locks on the back door. When he returned, his face was pale. "There are no footprints in the snow," he whispered to my mom. "None leading to the house. Just nothing." She shook her head, her eyes darting to the man by the tree. "That's not possible," she whispered back. "We heard him knock. Around 1 a.m. The man stood and dusted off his suit. "Well, I'd better be going. Big night, you know." My dad forced a smile. "Of course. Thank you for stopping by." The man picked up his sack and walked to the door. But before he stepped outside, he turned back to me. "Merry Christmas, little one," he said softly. "Be good to your family. They won't always be here." And then he was gone. The next morning, we found the gifts he'd left under the tree. They were wrapped in plain red paper, with no tags to indicate who they were for. Inside were simple toys, an old-fashioned spinning top, a wooden puzzle, a hand-carved train. They looked like they'd come from another era, the kind of toys you'd find in an antique shop. We asked our neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything strange the night before, but no one had. None of them had visitors, and no one recognized the description of the man. Even more unsettling, my dad checked the security cameras we'd installed after moving in. They captured everything: the knock, the door opening, and the three of us standing in the living room. But the man wasn't there. It was like we were talking to thin air. A week later, my mom was digging through old photo albums when she gasped. She held up a black and white photo of a man standing in front of our house, dressed as Santa Claus. His face was younger, his beard less white, but it was him. The photo was dated December 24th, 1948. We later learned that the man in the photo was named Henry Barton, a former resident of the house. He had loved Christmas, going door to door dressed as Santa to bring gifts to the neighborhood kids. But on Christmas Eve, 1950, he died in a car accident on his way home from visiting a nearby family. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night. Was it a ghost, a memory, or something else entirely? All I know is that every Christmas Eve since, I've left a gift under the tree, wrapped in plain red paper. It's not for me, it's for him, because wherever he is, I hope he knows that the spirit of Christmas he loved so much still lingers in the house he called home. Story number 7. Whispers of the Red Suit. The mall during Christmas is a world of its own. Twinkling lights hang from every corner. Carols echo through the air, and the scent of cinnamon and pine mingles with the ever-present aroma of food court fare. In December 2012, I worked as a security guard at Piedmont Galleria, one of Atlanta's largest shopping centers. It was a job I liked for its predictability, crowd control, lost kids, shoplifters, the usual. But that Christmas, something happened that I still can't shake from my mind. The season had been in full swing for weeks. The mall was packed daily with frantic shoppers and families lining up to see Santa Claus in the atrium. Our Santa's workshop setup was impressive, with faux snow, a towering Christmas tree, and an elaborate sleigh where kids could sit with Santa for pictures. The Santa we'd originally hired had called out sick that morning, and his replacement arrived just as the mall opened. I first saw him in the break room, a tall, broad man with a heavy red suit, white beard, and dark, glinting eyes. "Name's Richard," he said, extending a hand. His grip was cold, his smile too wide. Something about him set me on edge, though I couldn't put my finger on it. He seemed eager, too eager. The day started smoothly enough. Kids laughed as they climbed onto Santa's lap. rattling off lists of toys and gadgets they hoped to find under the tree. Parents snapped photos, and Richard played his part well, chuckling deeply and calling out, "Ho! Ho! Ho!" like he'd been doing it for years. But then, things started to feel off. The first sign was a little girl named Lily. She was about 6, with bright blonde curls and big blue eyes. When it was her turn, she hesitated, clutching her mother's hand. "It's okay, sweetie," her mom coaxed. "Go tell Santa what you want for Christmas." Lily reluctantly climbed onto Santa's lap, and for a moment, everything seemed fine. But then Richard leaned in, whispering something into her ear. Whatever he said made her face pale. Her eyes widened, and she let out a piercing scream. "No!" she cried, wriggling free of his grasp. "He's bad." The mall grew silent as everyone turned to look. Lily ran to her mother, sobbing uncontrollably. Her mom glared at Richard, but before she could say anything, he raised his hands in mock innocence. "She's probably just shy," he said, flashing a too-friendly smile. The mother hurried away, and the line resumed, though an uncomfortable tension lingered in the air. Over the next few hours, I kept an eye on Richard. Something about him didn't sit right with me, the way he lingered too long with some kids. The way his gaze seemed to follow certain families even after they'd walked away. A few other kids refused to sit on his lap, one even bursting into tears the moment she got close. By mid-afternoon, I decided to ask one of the photographers if they'd noticed anything strange. "You think he's weird too?" she asked, lowering her voice. "It's like, I don't know, he's trying too hard. Like he's pretending to be friendly but isn't." That was all the confirmation I needed. I radioed my supervisor, Jerry, and told him we needed to check this guy out. Jerry waved me off at first. "Come on, it's Christmas. Don't overthink it," but eventually agreed to look into it. Around 5 p.m., while the line for Santa was still going strong, Jerry called me over. He had Richard's name run through our system. "We've got a problem," Jerry said, his face pale. "This guy doesn't work for the agency. He's not even on their payroll." My stomach dropped. "Then who the hell is he?" Jerry didn't answer, but the look on his face told me he had the same question. I headed back to the atrium, my hand resting on the radio at my hip. When I got there, Richard was still playing his part, laughing loudly as a little boy climbed onto his lap. But his smile didn't reach his eyes, which flicked toward me the moment he noticed I was watching. I approached him cautiously. "Hey, Santa," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Mind coming with me for a quick break? Need to check something." Richard's smile faltered. "Can't it wait? Busy night. You know." I forced a grin. "Just a minute. Won't take long." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but finally stood up. As we walked toward the staff area, I felt the tension radiating off him. My instincts screamed that something was very, very wrong. The moment we were out of sight from the crowd, Richard's demeanor changed. His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Just a routine check," I said, keeping my tone even. "Shouldn't take more than a minute." But before I could say anything else, he bolted. Richard shoved past me, running toward the exit. I shouted for backup and took off after him, my boots pounding against the polished tile floors. Shoppers stared as we raced through the mall, their confused faces blurring together. He was fast, faster than I expected, but years of chasing down shoplifters gave me an edge. I tackled him near the south entrance, pinning him to the ground as Jerry and 2 other guards arrived to help. The police were called, and when they searched Richard, they found a knife tucked into his boot. His real name wasn't Richard. He was Samuel Reed, a man with a long criminal record, including charges of assault and child endangerment. Worse, he'd been on the run for months after escaping custody in another state. The thought of what could have happened if we hadn't caught him sent a shiver down my spine. Later that night, as the mall emptied out, I replayed the events in my mind. I kept thinking about Lily, the way she'd screamed. "He's bad." What had he whispered to her? What had she seen that the rest of us missed? I thought about how easily he'd slipped into the role of Santa, blending in among the cheerful chaos of the holiday season. How many families had he charmed? How many children had sat on his lap? Oblivious to the danger? I never found out what Samuel Reed's plan was that day. The police said he refused to talk. His only response to their questions a chilling, empty smile. To this day, I can't look at a mall Santa without feeling a pang of unease, because no matter how festive the season, there's always the chance that someone is hiding behind the mask, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And sometimes, it takes the innocence of a child to see the darkness lurking beneath the suit.